Daniel, the famous story with the lion's den, he wouldn't bow down and worship an idol, so they threw him into the lion's den, but after the whole night passed, he gets out unscratched. That's that Daniel. There's an entire book in the Bible written by him. Same thing, dreams again. He interpreted the dream. He was elevated to one of the highest positions in the Babylonian Empire. Now, the Babylonian Empire is probably the biggest empire the world has ever seen. The Babylonian Empire was huge. Maybe the Mongols was bigger, I'm not sure. Rome didn't get as big as Babylon, some scholars say. I mean, it was huge. It was powerful. Jewish boy who was a slave became one of the most powerful men in the Babylonian Empire. He specifically was given the job of being head over all the magicians. Now, I'm not talking David Copperfield. Back in those days, their magi's were extremely influential. They were superstitious people, and they wouldn't do anything without consulting with the magi's. So they were the power behind the power. If the king of Babylon wanted to make war, he would consult the magi and say, should I go to war? And they'd cut up some chickens and throw around some blood and dance like a bunch of crazy people and say, the auguries are good, go to war. And if they didn't like it, they'd say, the auguries are bad, don't go to war. Or if they didn't know what to say, they'd say, the fates say there will be great confusion and bloodshed will abound. So one day the king has a dream, and he sends for the magicians. He says, I want you to interpret my dream. It's freaking me out. And they said, sure, tell us the dream, and we'll interpret it. And he goes, oh, no, you guys are sneaky. I know your game. You tell me the dream and the interpretation. And they went, nobody can do that. So you're all dead. I'm going to kill you all and all your families. So they panicked. And then they heard about Daniel. So they said, well, there's this one Jewish guy. We hear he can do it. So he comes and says, no, I can't interpret dreams, but my God can. Give me a minute to talk to him. Maybe he'll give us the interpretation. Sure enough, God spoke to Daniel, told him exactly what the dream was and exactly what the interpretation was. Now, there's a whole book in the Bible written by Daniel. Daniel is the guy in the Bible who wrote the most detailed timeline for the coming of the Christ. If you follow the timeline in Daniel and count the years, you will come exactly to the date of Jesus Christ. Remember, he was from Babylon. Babylon was east of Jerusalem. Now let me bring you forward to the Christmas story. Wise men came from the east, magi, and they say, we've come to worship the Messiah because we have seen his star in the east. You're a Jew, you're thinking, how do you know anything about the Messiah? Because here we are, hundreds of years later, but a Jewish politician named Daniel, who became head of the Magi, shared the gospel with these people. And the Babylonians, who went from being idol worshippers, many of them became followers of the one true and living God. Oh, by the way, Joseph, if you go back to his days and look at secular history, there was one pharaoh in all of Egyptian history who was a monotheist. And if you put him on a timeline, he's right around the time of Joseph. Faith and politics can mix. The world has wrapped around it. Okay, see, we went from Joseph. We went to Daniel. Go past Daniel to a guy named Nehemiah. Remember, Israel was taken into Babylon? It's been about 70 years. Nehemiah, another politician, a Jewish guy, he's got the job of cupbearer. He's head of the Secret Service. All right? That's who he is. And he goes into the king's presence one day, and the king says, why are you depressed? He could see it on his face. Now you have to understand, it was against the law to go into the king's presence depressed. Believe it or not, it carried the death penalty. So him going into the king's presence depressed was a risky move. He should have called in sick, taken a sick day. He went in there, he risked his life. But he knew the king liked him, and he liked the king. They had a close relationship. So the king said, Nehemiah, what's wrong? You're depressed. He says, how can I not be depressed when my country lies in ruins, my people are scattered, and my temple is destroyed? So, well, what do you want to do? I want our country back. And you know what the king said? Okay, tell me how much money you need. I'll sign all the papers. Go do it. Tell me politics and faith don't mix. God is always using politics and faith together in the Bible. And it was because of Nehemiah. There's a whole book in the Bible about him, too. Because of Nehemiah, the children of Israel came back into the promised land, where the Messiah was eventually born. God's interested in politics. Listen to this from Daniel. This is what he says. God sets up kings and deposes them. God's involved with politics. He cares who wins. And I tell you what, whether it's Barack Obama or John McCain, it'll be God's choice. And you know, when I look back in history, God doesn't always choose like I would have. You know what? Whoever wins, I'm going to praise God for. I know who I want, but whoever wins, I'm going to praise God for, and I'm going to pray for that person. And if that person turns out to be a saint, I'll pray for him happily. And if he turns out to be a rogue, I'll pray for him harder. You following me? Because God's got a plan, and he uses good and wise people to fulfill that plan, and he uses foolish and unwise people to fulfill that plan. But be rest assured, God's plan will be fulfilled. And so I'm excited about the election, because no matter who ends up as president, God's in it, and I believe it, and it's going to be good in the long run. Have you ever wondered if all of us took the notion seriously that faith and politics don't mix? I was just listening to a lecture of a guy who served in Congress for several terms. Maybe he served 6 years, something like that. Not exactly sure. I don't remember that while I listened to his talk. But something I do remember, he started talking about some of the framers, some of our founding fathers for this country. And he mentioned them by name. He talked about Benjamin Franklin. He says, you know, everybody knows Benjamin Franklin was not a devout Christian. He said, but listen to this. And then he read a quote from Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention, how everybody was in turmoil, and Franklin said, it used to be our way of starting things in prayer and asking God to bless us and to guide us, and we haven't done that. I recommend we do it and do it now and do it regularly. Benjamin Franklin, non-believer from our frame of reference, more of a believer than most of the people we call believers today. This guy says, we all know Benjamin Franklin wasn't a devout Christian. We know John Hancock wasn't a devout Christian, or whatever, Jefferson. He threw out some names. I don't remember which one. But he said, what we don't know is 95% of the framers were. That's what he said. 95% of our founding fathers, the framers, were devout men of God. I never heard that before. And if somebody else had said it, I probably wouldn't have believed it. But he sounded like he knew his stuff. Men of God. Where would we be without people of faith getting involved in the United States? I know where we'd be. We'd still have slavery. You may not know this, but the vast movement of abolitionism was in the hands of devout Christians. Yes, there were non-believers involved too, don't get me wrong. And they worked just as hard and just as illegally. They put their necks on the line too. But the vast majority of the slavery movement was ended by Bible-believing Christians. Let me read to you from an article. It was not until the preaching of Charles G. Finney. Now, if you study missions, study church history, go to seminary, or read any books of any quality that deal with Christian history, Finney's name will be there. Finney was a circuit preacher, extremely famous. He was the Billy Graham of his day. But he was more than the Billy Graham of his day, because today Billy Graham's just a preacher and people think he's a nice guy. But back in those days, they took preachers very seriously. And when a preacher said something, a famous preacher, people listened. Today, not so much. So when I mention Finney, think of the influence of a rock star, but not with the silliness that goes with it. And you'll understand the impact a guy like Finney would have had. So, it was not until the preaching of Charles Finney that Americans began to realize that slavery could be done away with once and for all. Charles G. Finney, the great revival preacher, recorded in his memoirs, quote, I had made up my mind on the question of slavery and was exceedingly anxious to arouse public attention to the subject. In my prayers and preaching, I so often alluded to slavery and denounced it that a considerable excitement came to exist among the people. Finney went all over the world. He was a famous, influential star, and where he went, he condemned preaching. Slavery. Next thing you know, everybody's against slavery. That's what Finney said in his memoirs.